But let's dive in. Over the past few weeks, we have been spending our time discussing the idea that love has a name. And ultimately, this has been a look at Jesus Christ and how he is love personified. We've discussed the interactions with Zacchaeus, and we've talked about his interactions with a religious lawyer. And then just last week, we discussed the sinful woman and Simon the Pharisee. And all of these are pointing to a God that desires to love his creation. And he's directing us to see the way that he sees. And today we are going to finish this particular series, with a final topic on following Jesus. Now, as Christians, we typically like to consider ourselves as devoted followers of Jesus, and that's good, right? Like, you want to have a little bit of assurance that we are doing the work, we're following along, and we're living in the kingdom of God here and now. But it's also important for us to be honest and acknowledge that maybe we don't always follow him as closely as we should, or in the most life-giving way. And as we've discussed over these past weeks, we need consistent reminders of how we best pursue life in step with Jesus as we participate in a self-giving love of others. And we talked about things like there is a need to respond with understanding and validation towards others, even if we don't share their exact experiences. We talked about the need to slow down, and you might remember me talking about that because I talked about the right supramarginal gyrus. Maybe that rings a bell. In your brain, that is actually your empathy center. Yeah, that's a hard thing to say. I know, I said it one more time just to show off a little. Sorry, I said I wouldn't say that ever again, but I did, so my bad. But anyway, we talked about how we need to actually slow down so we can give our brain time to help move us toward better action that is seasoned with more care and more understanding and more empathy. And then last week, we asked ourselves the difficult question, and maybe you remember this one because it's the freshest. We asked ourselves, how is the story of love shaping me? And so today, I'd like us to consider together what following Jesus looked like for his earliest followers. And in order to do this well, we're going to look at a few accounts from the Bible that show what Jesus' idea of following him was and the challenges that many of us face as we also seek to follow him authentically. So, our main account that we already read earlier, that's an account that's recorded a little differently. You don't get as much in Matthew and as much in Mark, but it's recorded in 3 gospel messages total. So we're going to revisit this event and expand on it just a little bit as we take a closer look at what the first disciples experienced. So what's happening here? Peter and some of his friends, they're fishermen, okay? And they had gone out to work, and they had fished all night long, but they caught nothing. Which, if we go out and we fish all day or all night and we don't catch anything, that's a super disappointing way to spend your time. But it's especially disappointing because they are depending on that good catch in order to make their living. It's for their well-being. And so that day when morning came, they got back to shore and they began taking care of their nets and the boat. And they were getting everything organized for the next time that they were going to head out on the water to go to work. And while these fishermen were prepping things for that future date, Jesus shows up with a crowd of folks. And he finds Peter's boat is unused. So he gets in the boat, and then he asks to be put out a little ways from the land, which I just want to point out. We talked about Zacchaeus, the story of Zacchaeus. Jesus invites himself over for dinner. We talked about last week the sinful woman who just shows up uninvited. And now Jesus is just like, I need that boat. It's not being used. So what makes me chuckle this week, maybe it does you too, is that apparently invitations aren't really needed in biblical times. Something we're not probably quite as cool with. But anyway, so Jesus asked Peter to push him out into that boat a little ways away from the land. And so Peter does what Jesus asked him to do. And so Jesus goes out in the boat and he begins to teach the crowd. And once Jesus finishes speaking, he tells Peter to get back out there and go to fish. Now, Peter is an experienced fisherman, okay, who probably learned this skill from the family business and had likely been doing this for most of his life. And so I got to believe that he wondered, what does this rabbi know about fishing? What's this dude know? And so Peter does object just a little bit at first. And what I mean, he's almost a little bit dismissive here. Like, hey man, these guys, we do this every day and every night of their lives. That's what they do for work. And now this Jesus guy is telling them to do something that seems completely pointless. We were just out there, man. Why are you telling us to go back out? That seems like a real waste of effort, like a real waste of time. But eventually, they follow the instructions, even if they may have been grumbling a little under their breath about this rabbi giving us seasoned fishermen instructions. Luke records, though, that in the midst of this reluctance, we'll say, to follow Jesus' instructions, they started to haul in more fish than they had ever dreamed of. So much so that the boat actually begins to sink, and they had to call over another boat to help gather all the fish, and they're almost sinking because there were so many in their nets. Now, these experienced fishermen, they are taken back, and they're perplexed that a man seemingly inexperienced in that particular line of work could lead them to have such a large catch of fish. And it's after that Jesus tells these two sets of brothers. We have Peter, Simon Peter, our text called him, and Andrew, brothers, and then James and John. He calls them to follow him. And Jesus expected them to follow right away, without reservation. He called them to follow now, and they did. But not without one very interesting exchange first. And you'll see it up here on the screen. This was verse 8. It says this, when Simon Peter saw this, which is the great haul of fish, he fell at Jesus' knees and said, "Go away from me, Lord. I am a sinful man." Dietrich Bonhoeffer says it like this. He says, when Christ calls a person, he tells them to come and die. And I imagine that when Peter first met Jesus, he didn't realize how real of a quote like that from Bonhoeffer would be in his own life. And I wonder if Peter could have known, just how those next couple of years were going to play out. What would happen in his life? If he would have known that, he got the movie reel ahead of time. If he would have kept pleading with Jesus to go away. Because I know as I look around this room, we know that Peter's life had a lot of great successes, right? But Peter's life also was filled with great challenges. There were difficulties that he endured and got through that he likely would have never faced had he just remained a fisherman. But I'm thankful that that's not how God works. That's not how our life operates. That's not that's not how he operates either. We don't get all the details ahead of time, right? Maybe some of you are Garth Brooks fans if you're a country music person, and I think of the dance song. You could have risked the pain, but you would have missed the actual life. Now, Peter just knew in this situation that his life would never be the same, and he couldn't help but be swept off his feet by this encounter with Jesus Christ. It was as though that Peter and his colleagues, they didn't really have a choice in the matter. They had to accept the call to follow. Think about this. Each of these fishermen that day, they saw the crowd of people that Jesus was teaching, that they were following Jesus that day. They probably heard some of the words of wisdom that were being shared from the boat just out on that water a little ways. But that didn't automatically just transform into a deep knowing or some big, profound belief. Because we know the truth that's revealed to us later in Scripture is that they didn't have a lot of understanding yet. But what they did know is that they were about to find out. So they followed Jesus. But not everyone throughout the gospel messages followed Jesus so willingly. Not all were ready to respond completely. Our same author of this account, Luke, he tells the story of a rich young man, the rich young ruler text, who asks Jesus what he needs to do in order to get eternal life. And he explains to Jesus that, hey man, I've done a good job. I've obeyed the commandments. He's honored his parents, and he led an obedient life. Those are all really good things, right? I mean, there's nothing I want more for my kids than that. Like, hey, follow these commandments. Obey your parents, of course, okay? And lead an obedient life. And Jesus heard this man's question, and in response he said to him, and this is in Luke 18, you'll see it up here. He says, "You still lack one thing. Sell everything you have and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. Then come follow me." And when he, this is the rich young ruler, heard this, he became very sad because he was very wealthy. See, this wealthy man was interested in following Jesus. Like, this guy was interested in this, enough to approach Jesus. Like, hey, let's talk. And apparently, he'd even lived a really good life. But his interest in following further was based on what he wanted to hear. He was seeking reassurance that he had it all nailed down. There was nothing extra to consider. He wanted all of the guarantees. He wanted all of the freedoms and the good life without the risk of having to follow deeper. However, we know Jesus can see into everyone's heart, and this man was no exception. And it's interesting because many rich men are recorded in the Bible. There's a lot. Many of which owned a significant amount of property. They had great wealth. But God didn't tell them to give up all of their possessions. There must have been something else going on here with this wealthy man. Maybe it's possible that it just had something to do with his lifestyle. Maybe he had grown so comfortable with a certain way of living, and he just wasn't ready to leave that particular life behind. Yet that's what Jesus asked him to do. He asked him to leave his familiar way of living in the rear view mirror. He asked him to step forward into something better and not look back. And when we consider this one, I mean, we live in America, right? Even on our worst day, it's still a pretty good day. And it's easy to get really comfortable with our life. So when we see this text, we haven't even fully examined it because we've talked about it in past months. But this certainly is asking a lot. This feels like a big ask. And if you don't think that, that's pretty cool. I think it's a big ask. We can all agree that following on those terms, it's not very easy. It's hard. Now, throughout the gospel messages, we also encounter this group known as the Pharisees. They show up a lot. And these were a distinctive set of followers of Jesus. And maybe that sounds strange to you right there. Followers of Jesus and Pharisees. Those don't seem to go together. But they seem to show up so often in all the places where Jesus was present. And it's apparent that they were following Jesus to some extent. And it's clear that Jesus wasn't shying away from interacting with them either. However, this group of religious men, they weren't following Jesus in order to, find a true freedom or to gain greater understanding of what Jesus was saying and what he was doing and what he was teaching. Rather, they followed in order to find fault with him in any way they could. They followed so that they could find a reason to condemn him and to criticize Jesus. There was no intent on their part to reconsider. There was no openness to changes as they encountered life with Jesus. Instead, they were looking for confirmation that they were right. And that certainly that meant others were wrong. And that their way of devoting themselves to God was the only way. And because of that, they didn't even want to see Jesus as the promised Messiah that they had been waiting so long for. Instead, they opposed Jesus because his message was not about maintaining the religious system that they preserved and extracted value from. Jesus' message to them was a threat to their power, and a threat to their control. It flew in the face of their systemic injustice packaged around really fancied up traditions. And Jesus challenged their place of honor. He challenged their position of power, and they weren't okay with it. So they kept an eye on Jesus everywhere he went, trying to find anything wrong with him that they could. They questioned him about all sorts of things. They questioned his authority to teach. They questioned him on his standards on divorce. They questioned him about when to fast and when to pay taxes, and they even accused him of conspiring with evil forces to do miracles. ultimately, we discover that Jesus loved so differently from the way that the Pharisee group did. See, the Pharisees wanted people to change so that they could come follow them. Jesus wanted people to follow him so that they could be changed. And then let's just consider here, before we keep moving through this, our main text. Because the real highlight of the happenings centers around Peter and Jesus. But I want you to think about all those people that Jesus was speaking to on the shore that day. These folks showed up. They had heard something of what Jesus had been doing, and they had heard what he had been saying and teaching. And they may have even known these local fishermen that were working the waters that day. They had front row seats to watch all of these amazing events transpire. They saw the shrugging of the shoulders as they're getting stuff tidied up from the fishing expedition, and then now they're heading back out on the water. They heard the excited shouting. They saw this huge haul of fish being landed. They got to witness Peter falling to his knees there before Jesus. And then they witnessed Jesus and his new friends coming together and taking off. And I wonder for a lot of us that maybe you and I are a bit like these people in the crowd that day. We've all heard at least a little bit of, enough to know that something's going on with this Jesus thing. I mean, there's a reason we gather here on Sundays. You jump online with us. This is part of what we do. We've all heard enough. We've all seen the people around us that have had some really amazing sudden changes. And we've heard the stories, and we've watched how people's lives are turned around and people are saved. And maybe if you're at all like me, folks, you've struggled with a bit of disillusionment. That we think everyone around us seems to be on a great adventure. I mean, they have a rich testimony about their freedom that is founded in following Jesus. And it feels like our own following is a bit ho-hum. It's a bit blah. There's an old saying that goes, and I actually heard this from my friend Al over here this week. We had a conversation, and I like this saying. It says this: some people make things happen, some people watch things happen, and some people say, what happened? And maybe you relate to one or more of those categories. I think at different times I do. But the amazing part is this, folks, that Jesus doesn't want to leave anybody out. Just think about this setting that we had in our main text. He has a huge crowd on hand. And yet he focuses in on these fishermen. It reminds me of last week as he's sitting with Simon, the Pharisee, in his house. And yet Jesus has dialed in on this interaction with this sinful woman. See, he focuses in on the one so that then they can be welcomed into the family of God. And then they can go, as we would hear in this text, and now become catchers of people with the good news. And the good news, when I say that, it means this: that God has fulfilled his promise to conquer death and evil once and for all. And now he welcomes us into his family of true freedom and love. That's the good news that comes by way of Jesus Christ. And as Jesus dials in on these fishermen this day, it's a reminder that ultimately there are no sideline spectators in God's kingdom. And when we look at the beginning accounts of how disciples followed Jesus, and then we consider how, there were many others that didn't, we can see a lot of variety in how people live their lives, how they react differently in similar situations. And we know that life doesn't happen in a vacuum, and people are not all the same. And the truth is that's good. That's okay. Sometimes I think we've grown up in churches where we expect everyone's going to kind of look the same, dress the same. I've called it our homogeneous bubble. But that's not the design. It's okay that everyone's a little different. Because Jesus didn't come in the world to gather up all the perfect people, the best of the best, and then form some sort of a super elite club that meets weekly. That's not what he was doing. You're all elite in my books, but that's not what he was doing. Okay? He came for all people. He came for those who might have it a little more together and those who don't have a single thing together. He came for the people with the best reputation in town, and he came for those with the worst. He came for the people that were hurting. He came for the brokenhearted. He came for all of us who need healing in our souls. And he asks these fully human people, real-life people throughout the Bible, to follow him, and we are a part of that too. Jesus calls us to follow him and to follow the way that he lived. So, I always like to offer some actionable steps. Nothing we've talked about here is like remarkable things that you've probably never heard, many of us at least. But how can we be better prepared to respond, like Peter and these fellow fishermen disciples? How can we be better prepared to respond with an all-in commitment when Jesus calls each of us to follow him? Our first actionable step is that we have to acknowledge our baggage. I'm excited because coming in July, we're going to talk a little bit more about baggage. So this is just to kind of like throw a little something at you. We're going to talk about that more in coming days or weeks here. But the reality is this: as we walk through life, we have a lot of experiences, and these experiences shape how we view everything. Sometimes we might develop strong positions or strong opinions that can actually get in the way of following Jesus more closely. For some of us, pain and anger and hurts might be our largest baggage that we carry around. We might hold God accountable for the failings in our life and the failings in the world. We might harbor hatred for others that have caused some major hurt in our lives. I mean, I've talked to some people even just recently who really felt like in their time of need, God should have done something differently. And they've also felt in their time of need that they were abandoned by their so-called friends. Maybe you felt that way in your own life. I don't think that's a rare occurrence. I mean, these are the realities for many of us, and it's good, and it's okay to acknowledge these lived experiences. For others of us, it might be shame and guilt. Those might be the heaviest burdens that we are carrying around. We might have done something that we shouldn't have done, or maybe we didn't do something that we should have done, and now we feel like, man, we missed it. We missed our chance. That was my opportunity. And those kind of deep wounds and scars, they really slow us down, folks. They can disconnect us from following Jesus if we refuse to admit them, acknowledge them, and then begin to process them, begin to deal with them. In our account, our main account, we saw Peter acknowledge before Jesus his sinful nature. He came face to face in that moment with the fear that resulted from being a sinful man. And he tells Jesus to go away. That's what baggage does. Keeps Jesus at arm's length. But Jesus says this. He says, don't be afraid. Follow me. Jesus also told his followers later on in the gospel message found in Matthew, he says, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Jesus is waiting for us to turn towards him, admit our burdens, and lay them down at his feet. And as I look around the room, folks, we're a lot of seasoned veterans of the faith in this place, aren't we? Whoever's joined us may be the same. There's a lot of you are. And we know this is still not an easy thing to do, right? To actually put down our worries, surrender our deepest concerns. But the truth is, almost all the time, that is the very best thing we can do in order to follow Jesus closer. And then you'll see here another way that we can be better prepared to follow Jesus is that we embrace the scenic route. I was thinking about traveling when we thinking about this one. Embrace the scenic route. See, getting to any worthwhile destination is a journey. And sometimes you end up stuck on the side of the road with a really sick kid and you got to alter plans. Maybe some of you have been there, done that. Other times, you're broken down in a random town in Wyoming, the state of Wyoming, and you watch a pitiful 4th of July firework presentation from the parking lot of a trashy motel. Sometimes that happens too. I know that one from personal experience. But you know what? There's something about those moments that really stick with us. Cemented in here. And I think our life on earth is a lot like that too. There are all sorts of twists and turns, and there's all sorts of plot changes on the way to our intended destination. And if you're like me, which I hope you're not, I always say that, but I do know that this is part of the human experience. But if you're like me, you can get really mad about that stuff. You can get really upset about any change in plans, and then you can have it wreck your day, your week, your entire vacation, your month. Or, there is a better option. You can embrace the scenic route, because after all, that's part of the journey too. You can hold loosely your next adventure in your life without it producing devastation if things change. And here's the reality. If you want the straightest, if you want the quickest, most direct route on this journey, man, don't be surprised when you get really disgruntled with all of the detours that come along on your assumed path. Because that's what was the Pharisees' problem here, folks. They wanted the list of the do's and the don'ts. They wanted the list of the rights and the wrongs based on their exclusive religious experiences and traditions. They wanted the black and white, and they couldn't stand any of those gray inconsistencies that love, which is Jesus' way of operating, ushers in. See, Jesus was offering a call to come follow in the advancement of his kingdom beyond any old, antiquated religious systems. But they were not even willing to consider that possibility. When things are changing around us, which is happening all the time, right? When life is full of the scenic route and you are looking hard for the better path in order to reach your destination, this, I have found, is a perfectly good prayer to pray. God, I don't know what's next, and I need your help. Lead me and teach me what I need to learn and show me where I need to go. And in the waiting, this is the hard piece, our last step for today. And in the waiting and the crying out to God, you are going to have to continue to move forward. You're going to have to continue to move forward. See, in our account here, main account, we didn't get all the details about those people who were on the shore in that crowd that day, did we? We didn't get all those details. But we do know from later on in the text that the crowd that followed Jesus actually continued to grow throughout his ministry. And although many didn't move quickly like the fishermen did to this all-in approach of following Jesus, they did continue to seek him out. And I want to encourage you, if that's where you're at today, you're not alone. Because sometimes that's just simply where we are. We just continue to move forward. And Jesus calls us. He is calling all of us to come forward. He's preparing you and I for a readiness to step out of our preferred routines, of our comfortable standards of living, and to consider a departure even from our planned, maybe our obsessed over itinerary. We see in Peter and his fellow fishermen a readiness to go forward even if all of the details, it was muddy. Things were not squared away yet. See, Peter was ready for a new challenge, a more full life. And just like those first disciples, Jesus wants you and me to have the most freeing, the most abundant life founded in him. And we have to ask ourselves, honestly, do we? Are we interested in that? Because love is following Jesus. Now this morning, we don't normally do a lot of this, so this will be a little bit fresh for us here at First Church, but I just want to offer a little bit of a response time. This has been 4 straight weeks of, I think, digging deep. Maybe that's because I'm doing it a little bit during the weeks here, preparing. We've discussed a lot of love which I think is very ambiguous until love pierces your heart. Then love becomes a very real experience. And so we're going to offer a little bit of response time. There's just going to be a song that'll play here in a moment through the speaker system. I'm going to invite you to sit where you're at and to begin praying. To consider, where are you at in here? Has love moved you to truly jump in, all in with Jesus? And maybe you're at a different location throughout what we just looked at. That's okay. But I'd invite you to ask the Lord to search your heart, search your mind, reveal what's there. And if you would like to pray at an altar, there is an altar. We don't do a lot of altar calls anymore. But there is an altar if you'd like to pray up here. And if you do come forward here, I would be glad to pray with you if you'd like to pray about anything. But I'm going to join you and have a seat. We're going to listen to a song. And please enter a state of prayerful consideration here as we consider these words. Let's pray.